Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Shee, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I'm well, Jason. I've been doing some reading over the weekend, reading for pleasure, not for work.
Yep.
And I always feel a lot better mentally after I've had some reading time. So
Any time travel or dinosaurs this time?
no dinosaurs. There was some time travel. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a new series that I've got into, which is good fun. So I think reading is one of my mental health activities that I sometimes forget to do when I get too busy with life at home. So I need to remind myself to find some time to do it.
Well, we had a 3-day lockdown over the weekend. So
we did. It was a fantastic excuse to not go anywhere for me.
So just read your book.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, nuts. I can't get out of the house. I'm just going to have to stay here and read.
I'm sure introverts all throughout Perth were rejoicing. Yeah, I don't have to see people.
That's it. And I don't need an excuse to say no. It's a government sanctioned reason to be a loner.
Yeah, thanks, Mark McGowan. Yeah. Well, look, I'd love to introduce our guest for today. She has a PhD in organisational psychology and is a leading voice in New Zealand for psychological health and safety. She is the director of 2 New Zealand organisations, Leading Safely and the Resiliency Centre. And in case you didn't get it before, she's across the ditch in New Zealand. Welcome to the podcast, Dr Hillary Bennett.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, stoked to finally have you on. We've been trying for, I think, probably 2 months now to find the time that suits. So we are really keen to have a chat with you today.
All right, Hillary, before we get started, we do like to ask our guests if they have any favourite podcasts. So is there anything in particular that you like to listen to?
No, you're going to be powerfully horrified at this. I don't tend to often listen to podcasts, to be truthful. I tend to watch more YouTube than podcasts. I think maybe I'm more visual than an auditory listener. So hopefully I'm the right person for this podcast.
That's okay.
We've got a Flourish GX YouTube channel. So
we do. Yeah. Are there any channels in particular that you watch on YouTube?
I tend to, from a professional perspective, I tend to track the work that comes out of a group in the UK called What Works Wellbeing. I find their work really interesting and challenging, particularly over the last year with COVID, where they've been looking at the wellbeing not just from a workplace but from a community perspective as well. So I do a regular spot check on what they're up to. So that's probably my sort of favorite place to go.
Fantastic. That's a good suggestion for our listeners to go and have a look at.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So you're doing a couple of fairly big things at the moment. So can you tell us about your professional career and sort of how you've got to where you are?
Sure. It's an interesting I feel like I've sort of come full circle in many ways in terms of my professional work, because I started off in many years. It's too many years these days to actually want to admit to, because it sort of lets out my age. But in the mid-70s, I did my doctoral work in developing stress management programs for secondary high school teachers. And it was one of the first bits of research that identified that it's no use just toughening up the individual and leaving the system unchanged. You can get short-term gains, but you're not going to get long-term gains. And I really do mean it's a long time ago. This was probably in the late 1970s. And yet here we are, 2021, and I'm still having the same conversation. So my professional career has been strongly focused on trying to create workplaces where people can thrive as opposed to being harmed as a result of their work. And that was a conscious choice I made early on, as opposed to becoming a clinical psychologist. I really felt that an organizational psychology route would lead me to being able to work more proactively than waiting for people to feel some level of distress and and then supporting them. Not that, of course, that I devalue any of that work in the least. It was just my professional choice was to work in a more proactive space. So I've sort of traveled from the stress space. I spent several years working in universities across South Africa, Canada, and New Zealand. Came to New Zealand in 1993. I'd worked at Massey University, but I've always had a private practice, as I did, because I don't think you could teach in this area if you didn't have some experience. And I got to the point probably like 12 years ago that I would, actually that's not true, it was about 20 years ago, that I would just go out and do my own thing and not be connected to the university anymore. So it's been a long career in pretty much focused on trying to create workplaces that are mentally healthy, either supporting students to do that or supporting organizations to do that.
Thank you, Hillary. That's somewhat disheartening that, that research was done in the 70s and you're still trying to get people to make that that connection. So good on you for sticking with it and carrying on.
I probably had a little bit of, I've probably deviated along the way. So when I had the Resiliency Centre, my work was obviously much more focused on the individual. But I've come the full circle, and I spend more of my time now in terms of trying to change the workplace rather than initially just building people's resiliency. And that's just a personal choice. It's not that I think the one is better than the other.
I think it's one of the messages that we sort of fairly consistently talk about on here, that, there is that shared responsibility between the employer and the employee, but the efforts tend to still be focused on building up individual coping at the expense of looking at the hazards that are present in the organisation. And that's a fairly common observation that has come up from our guests here previously.
Yeah, and it's not only just a focus on the individual. I think it's also a focus on it's a reactive individual focus as opposed to a proactive work focus. And again, as I've said a few times, it's not that work isn't absolutely important and needs to be in place, but it's what I've been calling the blessing and the curse of an EAP, because of course we need to have EAPs in place and support for people when they are feeling some level of distress. But so many organizations think they've now done well-being because they've got an EAP in place. And so my latest thinking, I've got to write an article sometime on it, the blessing and curse of an EAP.
Yes. You sure you haven't listened to this podcast before, Hillary? Yeah, very, very similar observations we're seeing all around the world. But I guess you're from New Zealand, and you'll hopefully be able to give us some insights in terms of the state of psychological health and safety in New Zealand. Given that you've been beating the same drum for the last 40 years, I'm not holding my breath. But can you tell us any key stats or anything in particular that might give us some insight in terms of what does workplace mental health and psychological health and safety look like in New Zealand there?
It's actually not very different to the Australian stats at all. Some of the recent figures have been 1 in 6 New Zealanders will in their lifetime experience a significant psychological condition, and that 1 in 5 New Zealanders will at some point in time have experienced some level of distress. So, I think those numbers are pretty similar to Australia, 1 in 6, 1 in 5, 1 in 4. And I always would argue that when people are really significantly distressed, you think of the mental health continuum, if they're on the side where they're actually unwell, they're probably not in your workplace. So I always would argue with an organization that you could probably count on at least at any point in time, at least 1 in 4 of your staff to be experiencing some level of minor to significant psychological distress. And I always make the point that this is not about other people. This is actually about all of us. If we were sitting in a room and we just had to do a count of 1 in 4, a room of 16, that's 4 of us at that point in time experiencing some level. I used to use like the language of that. We may be struggling a wee bit. So I don't think the numbers are that different. I think that what I would see that in New Zealand at the moment, largely through the work of the New Zealand Business Leaders Forum, which is an organisation that was set up about probably about I'm guessing now about 6-7 years ago, supported by businesses who go through a membership scheme and to do some significant work in this space. And so really trying to influence leadership right at the senior level of organizations to understand what well-being is, to understand their roles and responsibilities, to be prepared to step back and start working more in the, as you were saying earlier, the hazard and risk assessment approach rather than the this, just providing some resiliency training or mental health awareness or mental health first aid issues. So I think that as a result of the work that the New Zealand Business Leaders Forum is doing at a senior level within New Zealand, we are seeing a real interest. It's almost to me, I was saying the other day to someone, it's like wellbeing's come of age, that all of a sudden we've seen this tracking over the last while where people are starting to be curious and want to understand a little bit anxious around it at times, like what does it actually mean? But in the last year, and maybe that's a COVID-related push, but I think it's more than that, organizations really starting to actually start taking this seriously. Of course, the challenge, though, is to get to small and medium-sized business. And in New Zealand, I'm not so sure it would be the same in Australia, but I can't imagine it would be that dissimilar. Is a large percentage of organizations here employ less than 10 people. So, where is the well-being storyline for small businesses, I think is something that we haven't really tackled yet.
Yeah, I'll have to refer you to one of our previous guests, Dr. Angela Martin, who spoke specifically about psych health and safety for small businesses.
Okay, yeah, we'll do that. I'll go and do a podcast.
Yeah, and there are some great resources coming out at the moment from Beyond Blue, specifically targeted at small business. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I'd say is a difference between New Zealand and Australia, and maybe that's a resourcing issue, and maybe that's because you've got much larger population mass. But when you think of the whole of New Zealand could fit into the size of Melbourne, that there are those organisations like Beyond Blue. There are various state-led mental health organisations in Australia that I think are doing some exceptionally good work. There's a good work coming out of Australia University on good work design. There's a work that's been done in your neck of the wood in Perth. So I think in that level, there's a lot more work happening than there is in New Zealand. But, relative population-wise, we're probably not that far behind. But we can beg and borrow from you guys as much as we can. Isn't that all in the spirit of Anzac?
Yes. And we just celebrated that, obviously, on the weekends, yes.
So you've probably already given us a little bit of information about my next question, but do you have some observations about the maturity of psychological health and safety in New Zealand? So it sounds like you sort of feel like it's starting to advance a little bit now.
Oh, yeah, it's certainly not mature. There's no doubt in my mind that it's not mature. I think there's a real curiosity is the word I keep wanting to use around what does this actually, what is mental health? I think there's still a little bit of confusion, or quite a lot of confusion, where people equate mental health to mental illness. And so there is a strong education piece to be had around what is well-being, that it is universal and that all of us have it every single day, that is really changeable. And that we don't separate our work and our home life. So there's a huge education piece to be done around what is well-being, what actually is well-being or mental health, or what we mean by psychosocial harm. And there's so much language in that space that I think that gets a little bit confusing for people. One of the things that I've been trying to do is to try and pull back on the language, make it much simpler. So I'm very careful of using the word psychosocial risks, even though I know internationally, if you look at the ISO 45003 standards that are just about to be launched in July, the draft's already out, they're using the word psychosocial risk. I find that when I go down and work with frontline staff, and I do a lot of that work, there's real confusion, and there's almost a little bit of concern that we meaning a psycho. So I have tried to use just language around, you know, you have an obligation to identify the risks, and those risks are to your physical health and your mental health. So just risk to well-being is the language I've been trying to use. Even psychosocial harm, although I know from a sort of a well-informed level, people will get that. I just think when you take that language back into businesses, you have to be really careful that you've got some time to get people to understand that, because it can be very daunting when suddenly you're talking about psychosocial harm and people don't actually understand what that is. Sorry, I've probably gone off on track in terms of that question. You might need to pull me back.
That's okay. I know the Australian Institute of Health and Safety has recently released a position paper that sort of part of the purpose of that is to clarify some of the language and try to have some consistent language, particularly aimed at OHS practitioners.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you weren't aware of that one already, that might be of
yeah.
well.
I think that's absolutely key to it. And the other thing was that I think in terms of maturity, I'm not quite sure what this looks like in Australia, but one of the things I've come across is that as people have become aware of the importance of starting to seriously look at protecting mental health in the workplace, all of a sudden on the critical risk register, the health and safety critical risk register, you see popping up the language, so you can have 6, 7 or 8 sort of physical harm risks, physical risks there, like working over water, confined spaces, etc. And then there's psychosocial risk. And so one of the things I'm really, really pushing at the moment is to get organizations to say, you have to step back and do as considered piece of work as you did around your physical risk, where you've identified them in terms of the specifics, that it's not okay to have on your critical risk register wrapping up all the potential risks to people's mental health or well-being as one term. So it's not a single risk. And that's quite an eye-opener. So, I don't know where that sits across Australia. Certainly in the organisations I work in Australia, I would say that they're not much further along that line. And I think that's an incredibly important piece of work for us to do, because when people then say, okay, so there are several risks in psychosocial risks or risks to well-being, the other concern I have is that people default so quickly to the ones that are sort of top of mind and the ones that actually get exposure in the media, so bullying and harassment. But when you talk to people about what does risk their well-being, it's so often more related to the way the work is designed, the way the work is organized, the way the work is managed, than it is around, constant harassment and bullying. So I think that's the other thing, is that in people's mind, they have a sense of what psychosocial risks or hazards are, and we're not stepping back and saying, well, what is the broad range of things that may be potentially at play in this particular workplace?
Yeah, I think that's consistent with what we've observed here in Australia as well. That I think organisations tend to think about psychological health as this sort of almost a black box of mystery, and they're a little bit afraid to try to do anything other than refer it on to a mental health specialist, and they definitely need that education in the work design and how work design can influence mental health, and that they don't need to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist to be able to do that preventive work. It is about how they're actually designing the way that work is done.
Yeah.
And it's not all about interpersonal relationships. There's a lot of other stuff that's a lot more significant for people.
Yeah. And in fact, the reason I do need to catch a plane this afternoon is that I'm actually going up to Auckland to launch. We've just developed a new resource called the Protecting Wellbeing, which is actually a framework for a facilitated conversation with a naturally occurring groups within organizations as to what might be the range of things that are impacting on their well-being that should be embedded in so it's not a tool or an instrument that's a one-off, but it's an embedded conversation that happens on a regular basis where the group starts to take ownership around some of the things that might be impacting on their well-being. And my message to the CEOs that will be at this forum tomorrow night will be to say, actually, if you're not prepared to seriously think about the way the work is currently done, with an understanding it may need to be changed, then don't even go here. You know, if you can't ask people to start doing serious risk assessment work around their well-being and identifying the risks, and then saying, oh well, sorry, there's no way we can actually do this. I understand that shift work is shift work, and if that's the nature of the game, that has to be done. But you know, there has to be a real willingness at the board and the senior level within organizations to take this stuff seriously and actually be prepared to think about how to do it differently. So it's quite a, you know, I mean, I'll be interested to see what sort of reaction I get, but I think if we don't seriously engage leaders of organizations to understand what their role is here, and also to understand that the challenge of this work is not a technical challenge, it's not a quick fix. We're changing years of way we've done work. We will not really get the gains that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you talk about your kind of evolution, because I feel like we've had similar career trajectories, if you like. I started in organizational psychology myself and had more of that systems level approach, and did a foray into risk management. Then I really started to pivot more into well-being and self-care and building resilience. And now I'm really back with that shared model of, well,
very
you
similar.
tell people to be mindful all you like, but you need to fix the work first. Otherwise, you know, people are still going to get harmed.
Yeah.
I really love that. And you're really blending the two now, I guess, in the two different companies that you're the director of, Leading Safely and the Resilience Centre.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about both of those organisations?
So the Resiliency Centre work, you know, to be honest, Jason, I don't spend as much work there. I'm re-energizing my work through that by looking at doing what I'm calling wellbeing coaching. So again, working with senior leaders and managers, ensuring that actually they're actually taking some time out to do diagnostic work around their personal and professional well-being, because actually if they're not tracking well, if they're not traveling well in that continuum themselves, it's very hard for them to provide some support. So I think there's two things, and the work I would do from a more systems perspective would be to say, you know, what you really need to have in place is leaders who can understand what well-being is, can go and have a conversation, know what to look out for, and that would, you know, that's a real systems focus. But at the same time, who looks after those people? You know, so those people need to be in a good space in order to be able to provide support to other people. And I'm not convinced that going to a generic resiliency building, stress management type program is what is needed. I think what's needed is a much more individualized, personal coaching experience around someone having an opportunity to look at how they blend in their personal lives and their professional lives, and what's working well for them and where there can be some changes. I'm not sure to the extent that in Australia, so I don't come across it often in Australia, but in New Zealand, the Mental Health Foundation has strongly adopted the work that came out of the UK on the 5 ways to wellbeing. Is that work that's familiar? Would that be familiar across Australia?
Not so broadly used. I mean, we do have some of our own guidance, but maybe for our listeners, maybe you can explain.
So the 5 ways to wellbeing is, I think, is an incredibly good framework at an individual level, but can also be used at an organizational level. And it was, again, why I endorse it, is that it's very evidence-based. So the research was done, if you think of the mental health continuum, between what distinguishes people that travel quite well, consistently travel better. They sit on the sort of thriving, going okay side of the mental health continuum, as opposed to the struggling or experiencing some level of harm side. What do these people do that is actually quite different to each other? And they came out with these 5 distinct areas, which I think they did a really good job in giving it some very simple language that everyone can relate to. So the 5 ways to wellbeing is what does seem to be a support to people's well-being is people that stay active, which we've known that for a long time, people that stay connected, which again, certainly over COVID, we've realized the importance of connections, but people who take notice, which builds on all the work around mindfulness. So people who, you know, are not living within their heads all the time, but actually are aware of things that are happening around them, to noticing the small things, sense of gratitude, etc. Now I've got to make sure that I can remember things. What have I done? So active, connecting, take notice. Keep learning is a really interesting one. And again, there's some research out of the UK over COVID, which has found that what COVID did was is gave people an opportunity to go and do some learning, some online learning stuff that they haven't done for ages. So it's not so much about the formal learning that seems to be good for our well-being, but it's more around, and I love this word, you know, it's this word around someone who's open to new experiences, curious about things. And so they don't do the same things over and over again. They try and they experiment. And those people seem to be better off in terms of the well-being. And then the last one is around giving. So not giving in terms of wads of cash to any charity, not that I'm saying that wouldn't be initially a good thing if you could afford it, but it's about acknowledgement, appreciation, recognition. So a lot of the work that we do on the individual basis in New Zealand, a lot of organizations are anchoring their work around that 5 ways to wellbeing framework, either to support individuals in a more one-on-one coaching sort of type environment, or to structure the wellbeing program so that the activities that they engage in for sort of the organization could be saying, well, this is a connect piece of work, or this is actually a piece of work that's given. And if they can be all 5 woven in together, then that's a real bonus, because then at least the energy and the resources that have gone into a wellbeing program, at least are based on some sound evidence that you're likely to get some return on this. So that is something I see when I go into Australia, is much more the Are You Okay type program. But in New Zealand, it seems to be, and it's probably because the Mental Health Foundation has adopted and provides a lot of free resources on this. But at a personal level, I think it's an incredibly powerful framework.
Yeah, from a public health approach, the Act, Belong, Commit message is a big one here in Australia. So that covers 3, I guess, of the 5 ways to wellbeing, if you like.
Yeah.
So that's probably the biggest continuous message that we get here in Australia.
I was working in Australia, actually out in Queensland, the year before COVID, which was 2019, and I was running a program. It was actually on safety leadership, but we were doing some work on well-being, and I had shared this framework with this group. They were a group of mechanics, young mechanics, and one guy looked at me very forlornly and he said, "Oh, I don't do any of that stuff." And then I said to him, "Well, tell me about something that you really enjoy doing." And his face lit up and he said to me, "You know, I've recently started coaching my kids. I don't know what the sport would be in Queensland, Aussie rules,
rugby,
or whatever it might be."
Yeah.
And he said to me, and I'm really loving it. And I said, "Well, let's try and think of what's happening and why you're liking it so much. Because, well, you're out there, it's physical. So you're getting out there and getting some activity. One, you're giving of your time and you know, energy into this little group of kids. There's no way you're looking after a group of 8-year-olds if you're not being very mindful. There's no way you're worrying about your worries at this point in time when you've got your eye on all of those. You've never done this before, so you're learning, and you're connecting with your community. And, you know, I can remember the sense of delight on his face when he said to me, he said, "So maybe that's why I enjoy it so much." And for me, it reinforced that actually when we think of what's good for our well-being, that very often those 5 threads seem to be sitting in the mix. And he went away feeling very pleased that he was looking after his well-being when he didn't think he was doing anything. So it's one of my stories I love to share.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I sometimes speak to companies or schools where we also work, and they're like, "Well, do we need to dedicate some time to be doing activities around wellbeing?" I'm like, "Well, most of us can do it just as part of our ordinary everyday activities. It's just, like you said, we don't think about it being a wellbeing activity. So there's plenty of things that we do, but we just have to, if we understand like these 5 pillars or, other frameworks, well, we can recognize that what we're doing is actually good for our mental health.
Yeah. Which is, it goes, the British Safety Council did a report that I think it came out in 2019, and it's called It's More Than Fruit on a Monday, or It's Not Just Fruit on a Monday, something like that. And, and I think it's such a good title for that, because what it's saying is that when you look at what organizations will do to support their well-being, because they get it, they understand they need to do that, but they're not quite sure what they need to do. And so the easy options, because it's got face validity, is to do the stuff that looks like it's is going to be effective. So, the fruit on the Monday and the massages on a Wednesday and those sorts of things. So for me, I think there's a big difference there. For me, that's a wellness initiative, and I've worked in an organization where there's fruit on the Monday and it's gone by 10 o'clock, and if I have to have a massage, I've got to pay for it. So, so I'm not saying that that wouldn't be good for someone's well-being, but it's not a well-being program. Whereas if you go back and say, what we land up doing in this space should be attached to something that we know makes a difference. And so you have to go back to the evidence-based frameworks and say, this stuff makes a difference. And then how do we weave this into our organization? So I have one organization that has, that I've been working with. So their well-being initiative was to encourage staff to engage in the Auckland Marathon. So now, of course, not everyone can run an Auckland Marathon or 40Ks. Not everyone can run 10Ks or even run 20 or 10Ks. But people can choose whether they want to walk, or they can choose if they want to be a part of the support team. If they want to be on the sides doing that, they can, and they can get involved in different ways. But everything that they do is connected either to an activity, or it's a learning to do something new, because I'm coaching somebody who's never done this before, or I'm giving, because the money that's raised is going to be given to a charity. So, that is a program for me that's so much more than fruit on a Monday, and it's way more likely to get embedded in, like, next year, what do we do that can touch base with those 5 things again, but be slightly different.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. If you're going to do a wellness activity, make sure it is something that at least all employees can engage in. Like you say, not everyone can run a marathon. Yeah. It's interesting what you were mentioning earlier as well around starting with the risk register. I was recently on the board of an independent private school here in Western Australia. And one of the last things I did, or we did as a board before I stepped off, was to review the risk register. And it's funny, in a school environment, we had everything like working at height, confined spaces, harmful substances, all this sort of stuff. And then when it came to stress, it was lumped into one row in the risk register, and it was staff and student stress. Yeah. And I was like, hang on, for teachers, stress, work-related stress is probably the biggest hazard for them. And that is, 90% of our employees are a teacher. So why is this not covered more in the risk register? And even before that, I remember a few years ago, speaking with the head of a large multinational company and who's responsible for health and safety. And he said, okay, well, this is all great, Jason, but how are we going to drive this? And I said, well, it's got to sit in the risk register. If you don't have it in the risk register, then you're not going to have it as a priority in your organization to do the risk-based activities that you need to do. It is going to be fruit bowls and yoga and all these things that sound nice and, like you say, have the face validity, but don't necessarily get the job done.
Yeah. So picking up your point, so now you're taking me really back to the sort of the late 70s, because at that stage, teachers were acknowledged as one of the most stressed occupational groups, which is why I had done my PhD in that area. So
Hillary, it's still the case here in Australia. So out of all occupational groups, teachers are just behind first responders for serious mental health claims here in Australia. So.
And when it's so if we don't take a risk assessment lens around that, we'll say we know that teachers get harmed mentally through their work. And so what we'll do is we'll toughen up our teachers, which sadly is what I was doing to my poor teachers, where actually if we do not look seriously at the way schools are run and some of the issues that they dealt with, that will be an issue. We also, as I said earlier, won't get impact. But the other confusion here, and I'd be interested in your responses around this, not that I'm coming to interview here, is for me, stress is an impairment risk, like fatigue is an impairment risk. So if you were going to make the distinction between a psychosocial risk, I wouldn't put stress as a psychosocial risk. I would put stress as an impairment risk that results as a result of many of the psychosocial risks that we do not control adequately in our work environments. And that often creates a lot of confusion in workplaces. So it goes back to that sense of, it's almost like we've got to go back to some basics here and say, let's understand what these risks might be and what's the difference between an impairment risk. I mean, I was reading someone's health and safety manual plan the other day that they asked me to review, and they had fatigue management done as the risk. And I think, well, fatigue management's a control. The risk is actually fatigue. So, huge confusion. And this is not because people don't care, is it? It's because they just don't actually have an understanding of how the risk lens goes into well-being, and that the nature of risks to well-being are so different to the nature of a physical risk. They're much more political because they're subjective. One of the things I find is many organizations don't want to go into this space because actually they don't want to seriously look at workloads. They don't want to seriously look at staffing issues. And in the work of imagined in terms of senior levels, they're quite happy to keep it going. And so it becomes politicized. And someone said to me the other day, the problem with doing a psychosocial risk assessment is that you provide the workers with some weapons. And I thought, gosh, that's such interesting language, isn't it? Surely we've moved on from that. But actually, that's the reality, is some people are fearful that when you start to take a serious look at these risks or hazards to to people's mental health, that it's going to become political ball, and it might well be.
It's just much easier to give people fruit bowls. So then open the can of worms. So then you have to do something about it.
Yeah.
But that whole idea about stress as, as impairment, we have discussed that actually very recently with Tim Marsh, because often we see stress as kind of like an outcome of being exposed to, psych hazards. And then obviously if you're exposed long enough, then it can increase the likelihood of depression and anxiety. So I would counter that. Maybe there's confusion because it's both. Stress can impair your cognitive functioning and then make you more predisposed to either be more risky or, be involved in accidents.
Yeah.
But secondly, just being exposed to risk continually can make you ill, which is also an issue.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so for me, I think the key thing for me is why definitions of how we see this is really important, is that if we see stress as the outcome, then we sometimes default to the way we try and fix that is by providing someone with some cognitive behavioral therapy and how they can review their thinking on this, which is a useful strategy, no doubt about that. But if we see it as what we're interested in is what's causing that level of harm, we're going to go into trying to do the design piece. So I think it's just that it's not that it's right or wrong. It's just that it influences how we actually go into address it and deal with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I spoke at a conference last week, and it was for health and safety professionals and talking about psych health and safety. And, once I put up the hierarchy of controls and said, well, where does self-care fit in the hierarchy? Right down the bottom. Wouldn't we be better off eliminating at the root cause if possible?
That's a really good idea. I think I might beg and borrow that one.
Yeah. No, I like using the CDC total worker health model hierarchy of controls because it fits in better, obviously. But for health and safety people, they can just understand how backwards the current approach to mental health is when you start looking at it using a hierarchy. So,
well, it's a bit like if you look at the most common corrective actions when you've had a safety accident, it's like be more careful. So in the well-being space, what we say to people, look after yourself more.
More resilient.
We still get emails from our bosses at 1:00 in the morning, and requests to do some work on a Friday afternoon for a Monday. And well, how do I look after myself in that scenario?
Yeah.
Yep. One of those classic double binds. This is what we've told you that we want you to do to protect yourself, but we're also going to give you these goals that you can't do both at the same time. So you have to pick one. And well, guess which one's going to, it's the one that's going to make us money that we want you to pay attention to, but we're not going to tell you that explicitly. We're just going to put it all on your shoulders to balance. And if it goes wrong, we can say that it's your fault for not doing what we told you to do.
That sounds very cynical of you, Jo.
I'm not cynical, Jason. I don't know what you're talking about. So we've talked quite a bit, Hillary, about this, I guess, the focus on building resilience for employee mental health. And I think we've probably already got your answer on this, but, is it enough to focus on building resilience? What else do we want to see organisations doing?
So I in my mind, I have a framework that I developed for the Business Forum, which says actually there's 4 distinct pieces of work to be done in this space. The one is to go in and do what we've been talking about and say, go and identify the risks to well-being and go and build in proactively the factors that we know people protects their well-being. And so in my mind, that's what I call that's the protect work. The resiliency training work sits for me in what I call foster, which is again proactively go in and actually help people build up their capability to deal with adversity, because adversity will come, challenges come to all of us at any point in time. So can we proactively give people the understanding what they can do and what can an organization to work in that space proactively? So 5 Ways to Wellbeing is a good example. I think if you as an individual or an organization puts into place strategies where you can say, we don't have to wait for people to be struggling before we can actually start connecting, start keep learning and all that sort of stuff. The third area of work, I think, is when people are struggling, and we know those numbers, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 in your workplaces, our workplaces, then what do we have in place to support people so that, again, if you think of mental health continuum, we can reverse the flow of that, if we can think of it in that way, rather than them moving further down that continuum to the point which they actually are harmed. So and I call that these things that people in organization can do to restore the well-being of people. And so peer coaching, peer support work, the work that having a quiet room in your workplace where people can go down and just take some time out. So very individually focused, and it is reactive because people are starting to travel along that continuum, but they haven't got to the point where we're going to go to the 4th piece of work, which I would call the support work, where you say, actually, this person now needs some medical counseling support. And my argument has always been in this space, which is, it's not a matter of either or. You actually need all 4 of those. You need to be proactively looking at what's causing some level of distress and trying to eliminate or minimize, and you doing good design work. You foster in a proactive way people's well-being, giving strategies so that they're in a better position when life gets a little bit hard. And when people are struggling, we try and step in early before they have to go to the EAPs. And then, as we all know, we fall through the cracks at some point in time. And it's important that we then have some way of trying to get some support. So for me, there is, if we are going to be really, if we're going to have some significant impact, we can't play, it's like any game of sport. You can't play in 1/4 of the game. You can't play, a good game doesn't occur in 1/4 of the field. It occurs across all 4 quarters. So I think in addition to resiliency, but it's foster building work if it's done proactively. Resiliency building could be restore work if it's done because people are struggling. But if we don't do the risk assessment, good design piece, and if we don't have the supports there, we still shortchange. So for me, it's quite clear in my mind that there's 4 distinct different types of work that needs to be done. If you go back to the view around New Zealand, I've recently just done a bit of work myself where I've mapped what people are doing across organizations that take this seriously. into those 4 quadrants and 4 approaches. And no surprise, the work that's been done is in the EAP, the support space, and in the foster space, and very little work, almost no work done in the risk assessment, good design piece. And so, it's very clear to me where we need to be pacing our energy, because that's not where we've been focusing over the last couple of years.
I think what you're talking about there aligns pretty closely with, so when we had Jennifer Lowe on, we talked about the sort of major accident hazard approach, so bow tie methodologies and that sort of thing. So it sounds what you're talking about there really aligns quite closely with that, where you sort of eliminate the hazards where you can, and then you prevent exposure to them where possible, recognizing that sometimes you are still going to get that exposure. Then you try to reduce the impact of it on the individual, and then you try to mitigate the severity of the outcomes associated with that. And you need to have all of those layered control measures in place to have an effective system.
Can I just pick up on something you said there, which is the use of bow ties in this space? So I might be on a limb here, but from my understanding of having done some research recently around what the sort of international thinking is about how to identify psychosocial risk, is that the traditional risk assessment methodologies that we would have used to identify physical risks in the workplace actually aren't appropriate. So although I see lots of organizations using bow ties, I sort of shudder, because actually it's an appropriate methodology to do if you're looking at confined space or an explosion or, release of energy or whatever that is. But my understanding, and I'm not saying I'm right, but it's just my understanding at this stage, is that particularly out of the European community, that the thinking around this space is that because of the nature, because the risks to well-being are distinctly different to the risks to physical well-being, in that they're much more subjective. As I said earlier, they're much more, as a result, they're much more political in nature. There's often a huge difference between what's perceived to be a risk between people who work at the top of the organization and those who work at the bottom of the organization. That actually, if we're going to do good work in this space, we actually need to go for a collaborative, participatory conversation approach, as opposed to the traditional quantitative risk assessment methods. And I'm just starting to get my head around of the space. I don't think that I wouldn't put myself up here as being, the total last voice on this. But I think one of the things I would really encourage listeners to do is to really reflect on the methodology used when they go to do risk assessment in this space. Because it seems to me that we have to start thinking about doing this quite differently.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the bow tie is a useful analogy to use when you're sort of trying to explain these concepts of the different types of control measures to an organization, but you wouldn't necessarily want to use that exact methodology when you're going through and doing a psychosocial risk assessment. And obviously it's a lot more about work employee consultation and collaboration throughout the entire process, which is, very different to what you would do from a sort of an engineering approach to developing a bow tie.
And listeners who've heard other episodes of ours will definitely have heard the message multiple times that when you're doing a psych risk assessment, don't just rely on survey data, the quantitative stuff. You really need to dive in deep and really listen to employees to really understand their perspective.
And it's a real challenge, because I've been facilitating so what I call well-being by design conversations to try and identify these risks. And so in any group, I think the key thing here too is, because it's so linked to the work, you have to have natural occurring groups. You can't do this you can't just take a random representative of people from an organization. It has to go back to the people doing the same work. And then in the conversation there, because it's so subjective, you'll get some people who'll rate let's just say workload as something that's not an issue for them, and then other people that see that it's really an issue, and it's no use just to average it out. And so the challenge is then, how do we find some middle ground there that's saying, okay, for most people, where do we sit on this without devaluing your outliers, because for them that's real, and then proactively move forward. So I think if we, if we go forward over the next while, this will be one of our real challenges, which is how do we, in a collaborative, participatory way, as I said earlier, have facilitated conversations that really can give everybody a voice, but still land at a position where we can actually move forward and do something different. And that's going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, and that work group piece, it makes so much sense as well. Again, one of the downfalls, I think, and you see this particularly in employee engagement surveys, there's this fascination with doing organizational level interventions.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't be falling into the same trap when it comes to, risk management of identified psych hazards by applying organizational level interventions. We need to be looking at least at the work group, if not, like you say, even smaller clusters within work groups that are affected.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's really, really key, which means that it's going to be a much more timely process, isn't it? Because, we're going to have to go to all these different sort of work groups. I was working at an airport recently trying to trialing some of this stuff. So I was working with the firemen that wait in their machines to go out, and if a plane comes in and there's a fire and it goes in, there's rescue stuff, and then working with the people that work in the control room, and then working with people that might working in security, getting people stuff through X-ray machines. So the issues that arise in those three groups, they all work in the airport, but they are so significantly different that previously we wouldn't have tended to go into those natural occurring groups, and so the learning for this particular airport was actually, if we're serious about this stuff, we're going to have to do different things for different people, because there are different things that are putting people at risk across those different types of work. But can I just pick up on your work on the engagement side? So I don't know if you experience this, but I often get people often say to me they'll use their engagement scores as a measure of well-being, and I think, no, you can't do that. Because how often because engagement is a discretionary behavior, and I go beyond my call of duty to do whatever, because I'm so enthused and energized by this work. Those are exactly the people that burn themselves out. So I always push back when people say, well, we can use our engagement score as a well-being. I said, no, you can use your engagement score as a measure of people's willingness to give you discretionary effort. You can't use that initially as of where they would sit on that mental health continuum, because they might be actually right at the bottom end just because they are so engaged.
Yeah, I should clarify, I don't see them using the end score, engagement score, as a substitute for a wellbeing measure, but they look at mapping some of the factors or constructs that are picked up within the engagement survey and map that as onto their psychological risk. So it might be workload or leadership, support, that sort of thing. Yeah,
totally get that. Yeah.
So talking a bit more about the psychosocial risk assessment element, Hillary, have you got any experiences you can share on how a robust risk assessment could be conducted?
I do, but it's very it's been a testing period for me a trialing period for me over the last while, where I've been going in and actually using a framework that I've developed, which is anchored by the mental health continuum, and in saying there are protective factors that can support people to thrive, but there are risk factors that can harm people. And I've identified four categories of these factors. So some related to the tasks of workload issues, clear expectations, etc. Some related more to the social elements in terms of relationships. Some more to the individual around progression and advancement and being able to balance work life, etc. And some more to organizational. So all I did is I sort of reviewed all the international literature that I could lay my hands on, so that I felt comfortable. I picked up all the issues that we know can either protect or risk people's well-being. And I put that into a framework, which I call Wellbeing by Design. And I'm using that as a framework to have facilitated conversations. So as a facilitator, I'll go in and we'll talk through, and I can do it in different ways. I can either get a group to systematically work through that and rate themselves on where they personally see that, and then share their insights with the group. And it takes about 2 hours to do this. And I've also then linked it to say that if you, on a 10-point scale, if you're on the lower end, that would say your work's a bit toxic, hard word, I know, but or otherwise, your work's decent, and decent's not just a word I pulled out of the air. It's actually linked to, in New Zealand, it's enshrined in the Human Rights Act as, we should at least give people minimum standards of work and equal pay for equal work. So it's sort of, for me, that's just the basics. All you can people have to thrive. And I've done it in different ways. So as I say, sometimes just using the framework, working through issues, sometimes asking people to look at it first and then come back and rate themselves. I've done it for a review where an organization's actually been given an improvement notice, and I've done an internal review using that as my framework to identify why this particular group had raised an issue around their psychological health in the workplace, and have used that to guide my review. So, sorry, long story short on that, I think where I'm tracking in the work I'm doing is to go and always to have it as a conversation piece with a group of people who know the work intimately, and to not just go in with a deficit lens, but to go in with a lens that says there will be, in the way your work is designed and organized and managed, some stuff that's really working well to protect your well-being, and we should actually pay attention to that, and we should actually say, how do we maintain that? So not just doing a straight, could risk you in terms of harm, but also say what's in your work at the moment that's protection. So trying to work both those sides of the equation is what I've been doing, and I've certainly been getting some good feedback on that. The challenge is, I don't think that work should be reliant on consultants coming in to do that work. So I think you have to build internal capability. So again, the value of the New Zealand Business Leaders Forum is the work we do, or I do on their behalf, that goes into open source and it's accessible to anyone. And so you can, what I'm saying to organizations, once you've got an understanding of it, and you've got some good facilitators, they could be health and safety reps, they could, they don't have to be, they just need good facilitation skills. That then would become part of that process, that team taking responsibility for their ongoing well-being, and every 3 months or so going in and just revisiting that and looking at what could be done, and to either eliminate or minimize, and if they can't eliminate or minimize, then move it into the foster space and say, okay, so what do we need to do to protect our well-being, what strategy? So trying to work those two together, I suppose, is what is where I'm spending a lot of my time at the moment anyway.
I think definitely important to tease out the protective factors that are present, and look at how organizations can maximize the benefits from those, as well as looking at the addressing the hazards. Yeah.
And it's interesting to see what people do see as protective factors, and often it is just having good collegial relationships, and again, not rocket science stuff, is it? But the importance of mates looking after mates, and importance of actually helping out if you see someone struggling. It's that sort of stuff that's really very key to protecting people's well-being. And so people can sometimes endure quite a lot when they've got that. And I say that cautiously, because you don't want people to endure hazardous work context because they've got good colleagues, but yeah,
you can endure to a point.
Yeah.
But then it drops off pretty quickly once you reach that tipping point.
Yeah, no, incredible work. There's so many things that you pulled out there: the importance of good consultation, the importance of building up competence within organizations, the need for companies to be self-sufficient and not reliant on external expertise. They're all things that we're also trying to address here. So I think they're all really important.
Yeah.
But you've been involved now in this space for over 40 years.
Yeah.
And so we've had a bit of a retrospective with you during the course of this podcast episode so far. But if you had to look into your crystal ball and look into the future, what would your hopes for the future of workplace mental health look like?
I think it would be that we've normalized the conversation around mental health, and got people to really understand this, that we all have it every day, and this is not about supporting people because they've got issues at home that's getting in the way. I would love it that we actually understood that in the same way as we wake up in the morning feeling physically sometimes chirpier than others, that we do the same in terms of our mental health, and so that we really can support people to stay on the thriving side or the going okay side, and that is in the same way. I'm getting myself a tongue tied here, but if instead of just doing redesign work because it's good for efficiencies or productivity, but we actually redesign because we value people being on the thriving end of that continuum. So I know we've had a lot of focus on safety culture, we've had a lot of focus on engagement culture. I would love to see in the next while that, that the word thriving culture is just something that we all sign up for, and that actually, because we spend so much time in a workplace, it seems to me the most obvious place that we can have such a significant impact. If we could really get senior people in organizations to sign up for, actually, they are as committed to people going home physically safe as to going home mentally well as they are to physically safe, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, hear.
All right. And do you have some parting words of wisdom that you'd like to share for professionals who'd like to work in this field of psych health and safety?
Oh gosh, I don't know if okay. I think that I would say to those professionals, I said, don't rush into putting into place what seems to be at first blush a well-being activity without taking time to see whether there's some evidence that it's going to work, not to rush into doing the work that seems to look like well-being work, so the resiliency work and the mental first aid work. Again, as I've said several times, not that I'm devaluing that work, but here's my fear, and this is to these professionals, is that work will suck up all the resources and it won't leave anything left to do some good design work. So first of all, go and do your diagnostic work and let that inform the wellbeing programs that you then put in place so that you can actually embed it. That would be my parting words of wisdom.
Very wise words there. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Hillary, it's been awesome chatting with you. I'm glad we finally made it work with our schedules, and glad to get you just before you had to fly off for a conference, and hopefully that conference goes really well and the message is received well by those business leaders.
Yeah. We're also lighting up the Sky City tomorrow night for International Health and Safety Day. So yeah, it will be an interesting little sojourn. The Sky City being our big tower in Auckland.
Yeah. Well, it's so great being, getting to know a bit more about you, the work that you're doing, and some of your perspectives. They're definitely very well aligned with the show. So you're a perfect guest for the Psych Health.
And I promise, guys, I'll go and listen to some more podcasts. I should have done that before.
Oh, that's all right.
Not well prepared.
But look, that brings us to the end of the episode today. So thanks again to Hillary. Don't forget, we do record these over Zoom. So if you want to see the full video rather than listen to the podcast, as Hillary has said that she prefers to do, we do have that on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. Great. Also, if you prefer to see just the little snippets, the nuggets of gold, and there are a few today again, you'll be able to find them on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. And then, Joelle and I are very active on LinkedIn, so you can also feel free to follow us or connect with us directly. You'll find that despite how Joelle appears on the podcast, she's actually quite friendly.
At first, yeah.
Until you get to know her. But that's it for today's episode. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.